Many of us are familiar with fairy tales. Probably the best known collection of fairy tales that we have in a modern day were done by the Brothers Grimm. It's where we get all kinds of different fairy tales, but they didn't write them. They collected them from other people and wrote them into a book. Something for a keepsake, for people to keep and have for all time. Just some little fairy tales, some of which explain you why certain things happen. There's an Aesop's fable kind of written in each one of these, and usually woven into the story is something that gives you an abject moral, but it also every time appears to tell you what to do or what not to do. Effectively, what not to do in a lot of cases. So these collection of fairy tales were basically taken from Germanic folklore, but from around other places by the Brothers Grimm here that we know. But they go back quite a bit in time. And people know about these tales, of usually they begin in a forest or usually contain a forest in it. And usually that forest is a bad place. But it can also be a good place and a haven, like in the idea of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which I did a video on, and I've done a video on a lot of folklore, where that all comes from. I studied a lot of it whenever I tried to play Dungeons and Dragons as we were younger, and I wanted to get other ideas and things, and it's amazing the stories that were coming out of this, and the idea of women, maidens caught into a tower kept by an evil king that you have to go overthrow to free her so she can free her people, and all these things. Usually in these stories there's a wicked forest. It's not too far away. Bad things can happen in that forest. But it's meant to be the unknown. And by utilizing the unknown, you can make up all kinds of things or creatures that dwell in there and reasons for things happening. Like if a child wanders off too far in the forest, Baba Yaga had gotten them. She's a witch that lives deep in the forest. Did a video about Baba Yaga here a while back too. This is more looking at it as a culmination and an oversight, though, but I do want to mention some things that are pretty important to this concept. Because in the Brothers Grimm idea that we have in Snow White and all of these things that we see, there are elements of that story that try to place them somehow in a medieval age. And it was thought some of those tales were 150, 200 years old and so on like that. But in actuality, they come back from a much, much earlier age. In fact, a lot of our pagan beliefs that we see today, when we look at what other people were thinking other than the Bible, that's been pretty much driven into the ground, we find their tales woven into that continue and do so, and somewhat looking at a more modern form of it, but actually in ancient times, where we can see the tale of Dumuzi and the rites of spring and why spring happens and things like that. But the famous one that we know about, and only found out about the Dumuzi one here recently, is the tale of the Greeks of Adonis and how his rebirth comes in and does the things. Amazingly, they tell you that you're not supposed to say Yahweh in the Bible, and they want to replace it with Adonai, which is just clearly showing you what this connection was supposed to have been. And then there's Jesus, but that's been told 3 times at least now, hasn't it? Or more. Were there tales before? How far do these Sumerian tales go back? Well, Like I've told you before, I believe they go back much older than that. It's not like, and then they built the city, and then they started making up this stuff. When does astrology go back to? Well, we find cave art that shows you they had Taurus going on and these other concepts. We don't have any writing. We can't turn around and say, well, here's a tale about things, or what they might have had a fire right in front of that thing and then started telling people about. But what we can do is take linguistics and things and trace these fairy tales back to an earlier age and see just how far it goes. Certain tales like Rumpelstiltskin and this guy that's a little helper that's a dwarf of the forest and so on. How far do they go back? Well, researchers have now figured out that fairy tale origins are thousands of years old. That they go back through the time that we're talking about as being a biblical time, all the way to the point that we would think of as something prehistoric, many of which could reach towards the last ice age, and it's possible that they stem from tales that come from even before that. Some of these tales, like Beauty and the Beast, have been seen to go back probably 4,000 years old or more. Using techniques that are usually employed by biologists, academics, studied links between stories from around the world and found they had some prehistoric roots to them somehow. That this all connected to an ancient people, that whenever they spread out, these stories went with them. And because of local folklore that was already kind of going on at the time, they blended it into a story that's a variation on a theme, but the same story. It happened in the Orient and India. It happened in Yemen. It happened all around the Mediterranean, North Africa, Egypt. You can see these tales they wove into their mythology and their religion, and that other people do, and by studying an idea of comparative religion, not as old as that we're talking about here, where these original tales come from, but things that were derived from that, taken into what we call religion today. Our religions, whether you call them pagan or not, but it's pagan beliefs and things along that line, and it's basically based on folklore. And the ancient tales that got expounded into the idea of religion come from a time well before then. It traces back to the Indo-European languages. And although these stories had thought to be in the 16th or 17th century, certain ones, like Jack and the Beanstalk, was rooted in stories classified and a variation on a theme and from all different types of places, as the boy who stole the ogre's treasure. Sometimes it's also the boy who stole the king's treasure. It later can be turned into the boy that stole Aladdin's lamp, and other tales. And it can be traced back whenever Eastern and Western Indo-European languages split more than 5,000 years ago. So they're going to give it that idea of its 5,000 year date, or over 3,000 BC, whenever people used to have all the common languages and Indo-European languages split. It starts to sound like the Tower of Babel, but if you look into linguistics, the languages of all these people are based on a people that used to live on around the Black Sea area and just above what we consider the Middle East at one time as Proto-Indo-Europeans, and they spanned all the way across from what we call China today into India and across the Middle East and up into Europe as far as people could go whenever there actually was not an Arctic shelf above that. Some of these tales, which involve something like in Dumuzi's tale, where it talks about evergreen trees and so on, actually show that whenever they're talking about this, this is a people who had been up on the boundary of points where they get winters and such, and they experience the fact of evergreen trees lasting on when everything else dies. You can take a fairy tale out of that, and it ends up becoming the tale of Dumuzi, how he comes out of an evergreen tree. And they even tell you in the Bible where these other pagan people, they used to chop down trees and put it in their house towards the dead of winter and do these things and da da da. That's our Christmas tree, people. Tannin is actually a conflagration of words in that ancient astrology or astrotheology videos I've shown you here recently, where it's all written in the stars. Look up my series on that. Tannin is in there. It can get twisted into a word which corresponds to an oven in there. But whenever you say that a Christmas tree in Germanic languages, which is hooked up to this, is known as a Tannenbaum, it has something to do with this tale that's written in the stars. How long have ancient shamans and stuff like that, and people that were helping to control the population and make things happen, tell little tales like this? Well, as long as we've known about it, for sure. A lot of these can be seen as taken into agriculture, and when people started agriculture, depending on where and when you think that happened. Analysis showed that Beauty and the Beast and Rumpelstiltskin stories are over 4,000 years old, and a folk tale called the Blacksmith, and how the blacksmith gets magic to be able to make all these secret dwarven weapons, these exotic things that you hear about as Hephaestus. And you know, all the dwarves made these extra special things where they live up over this way and stuff. Well, the people that were talking about that comes out to Proto-Indo-Europeans. We look at them and they had excellent metalworking skills, but strangely, they actually show you that they believe that tale goes back almost 8,000 years, and that actually predates the Copper Age or Chalcolithic. And it could be the origin story of how they get that. But then there's always this tale, you see, how people got something. Like how they got fire from Prometheus, whenever we know people had fire way back before that. I mean, come on. But they show you that. But then there's this idea of how we were given things magically by all of these creatures that we call a deity in some way, and it just came out of there. And a lot of times it correlates to people that came from the stars, or they were the stars, and so that leads you to believe in a UFO, an alien intervention, all kinds of things. That's not for the scope of this video. But in that fact, mankind was given certain things. See, that's a tale of how you got something. Just like in the Bible, whenever they talk about this Naga serpent that's a half human that can talk, turns into a snake, this is how the snake lost its legs. Strangely, these are old tales. I mean, imagine how long people have looked at a snake and come up with the idea after seeing lizards that have legs and they don't, but they look related to them, how the lizard lost its legs. Of course, this has to go with talking animals and so on. And if you study the Bible, there's all kinds of things other than talking snakes, like there's a talking donkey in there. It's where we get the Shrek thing from. And people still can't see that this whole thing is a collection like Grimm's fairy tales, but woven together. It was done so extravagantly that it's taken 2,000 years before people have really started to crawl up from under a rock and realize how this all works and the truth of how that went. They snapped out of it. They finally heard one time that a woman grew from a rib and ate from a magic tree because a talking snake told her to, and they were like, what? It comes from folklore, and of course, like it shows you here again, Jack and that beanstalk may be over 5,000 years old. Well, it can go a lot from there, and you can imagine somebody said that where this comes from is somebody taking mushrooms. See how that goes with those gnomes and those little people and all of that, and sitting there staring at the ground, looking at a new sproutlet of something coming up, and come up with this idea of giant things. And there's a tree, it looks like a whole much bigger point of that. How big could it be? Could it be a world tree concept too, out of this little bean, these magic beans? See, there's magic again. But the story of a bean is magical. So you can take the bean off the vine and take him and dry him outright, and then just hold on to him. And then you'll have food whenever beans aren't even growing anymore. Hey, you want something out of season? Make it happen. This is woven into the tale of the grasshopper and the ants, where the ants collect for themselves correctly, but the grasshopper doesn't do any collection. He just yum, yum, yum and eats like a cow. Well, lo and behold, in the dead of winter, see, these people had winter around there where everything dies off, except for those evergreen trees we're talking about, and lo and behold, the grasshopper gets screwed over. This is another thing that shows agriculture is based in a lot of these tales where you want to turn around and make things, and there are plants that just automatically grow again. I mean, an apple tree keeps making apples every year. But there's a concept called Johnny Appleseed where you can take and make your own trees. Boy, this is a magical concept too. You can imagine how far you may go back before it would seriously be a magical concept, how people made trees in a certain place. And of course, Johnny Appleseed's something that I watch the stories of, and that's folklore. But that's folklore in a modern time. There's a lot of folklore in a modern time and in the Americas when the frontier was being done so. And Davy Crockett, he can jump the entire Mississippi in one bound, and he killed a bear with a pocket knife and this, that, and the other and everything. Well, you know, some of those things happened. He actually killed a bear with a pocket knife one time they got attacked. It's an amazing thing. Props up this hero, but then because of tales like that and a few others and how he could go out and tackle that frontier, they started making up all kinds of crazy things about him. If you ever watch the more recent version of the Alamo movie, they kind of play that up there in part of it, and then whenever he's going to get killed at the end, he's like, that's just folk tales, man. That's just people. But they were, you know, the Mexican army thought they were killing a god in some way or something, and that was just Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. Well, that's in a modern time, but how long does this folklore go back? It goes back well before recorded time. You can say double the time of recorded time that we have here. And then it gets back in the Ice Age, and here goes that blur concept again, where people have no idea of it. But back when these people were together, for this spreading out that they keep showing you is the cause and effect of that spreading to a lot of different people, and these common tales weaving down through time that they've been able to decipher back through and realize that, yeah, they all come from a certain point. How long were these people telling tales? Were they original Cro-Magnon type people that actually started this whole type thing? Or they got some tales? Was there Neanderthals that had a few tales, and then these Cro-Mags got a hold of the idea and they go, you know what? And started making up all kinds of tales to let people know. Something to say around the campfire, to do things and to teach stuff. Some of them are pretty intricate too, and you can get something out of it as a child, of course, but then you can also, rereading it whenever you're an adult, get a totally different view on this situation. And perhaps becoming an elder or grandparent, looking back at this and seeing this being told to a youngster and to children, would actually get a whole nother envelope of a thought and an idea here. Grandma can tell some great tales. Used to be something that women had. They had this gift of gab, and they still have it to this day. I'm probably well aware of it. I've been told I have it somehow, and I guess you can see that because I can't ever shut up. But then that gift of gab women have, they don't use it like they used to anymore, for they used to ended up learning all kinds of tales and stuff. One weaving story that's put that in there is the tale of 1001 Arabian Nights. We'll get to that here later. but women used to know all kinds of tales and all kinds of things that went along with ideas of sowing and concepts there that went with sowing of clothes and sowing of seeds and all kinds of things. It's amazing the depth of all the folk tales that we do have, but these people were just actually looking through a few of them and finding this idea where this guy has this similar trope. And how long does that trope go back? And it seems to all go back to an age 5,000-6,000 years ago. There's a couple they peg out might be 8,000 years old, because that's probably the origin of a flood tale. And I've talked about this probably far too many times, but this Jack and the Beanstalk, and it involves giants, and of course an idea that you could get up on something and then get up on the clouds. And there's a castle in the clouds that he goes and tries to steal the golden goose or whatever goes on here, people, but that's the idea of heaven, and you can't catch it if you're not thinking about things from a third-person point of view, really. But there it is. For in the ancient Bible, it told you that heaven was a city in the clouds, and we haven't run into one with an airplane yet. So it must be able to teleport around real quick. No, it's farther than that. The heavens are actually up in space. Well, those stars aren't even a conglomerate to there, and we can't breathe in space, so what's the reality of it? Well, it's this fairy tale thing, this fairy tale world concept. Whenever you die, you climb your beanstalk, just like all of the people that were into the effect of boating and being able to go around and do all these different places had tales where they took a boat and they rode it up into the giant rivers in the heavens. I showed that recently in here, and another showing of that written in the stars. I beckon you to take a look at it. But how long does Jack and the Beanstalk go back? Well, it goes back well before recorded time. And see, all of these are connected to what's used to be called the Aryan languages. Now they, because of World War II and the propaganda and fairy tales that came out of that, by the way, are ended up now being referred to just as Proto-Indo-Europeans. And you can see the names and voices actually in linguistics spread out across here, and all the people that were involved on it. If you want to really look deep, hopefully it's in good enough. This is in 4K, and you can pause it, maybe even zoom in and see all the people in linguistics. But it actually goes all the way from India and Sanskrit, which is a Proto-Indo-European language, to Ireland. In fact, they've made so many connections where these same linguistics hooked up together. Just as simple concepts like we would call your mother and your father and things like that. Common words taken right here. It's not a loan word situation, people. They realize that situation's going on too. But they're looking into it deep. This is the way it worked out. So the tales of the Mahabharata and things like that are fanciful tales too, but what were they woven from? Back to another concept. There's this idea of the blacksmith that I told you about before, and there's something like a genie situation where the devil, in a modern day we would think of it as the devil, but this trickster situation goes on, and because he wants your soul or something real important, he'll give you a wish of this if you'll give him something of that. And what you're supposed to learn out of this is how to be crafty and get out of that idea but still get the thing that you want. And this is the story of the blacksmith and how he learned how to create all those great dwarven things, and he stole it from, in a modern day, in a devil, but in another tales it was a genie. In other tales it goes back to a elf that lived in the forest, and that man lives for thousands of years, and I've talked about where elves generally come from. But in this idea of viewing it, he actually tricks the guy, and in fact, a major portion of the situations going on here, he actually tricks the guy, and then he is able to create weapons, and he sees if he's going to be able to do that. And the first thing he creates is something to nail this devil to a tree. Usually a tree, later it becomes stone. So it's believed the origin of this was in tree whenever there was woodworking, and it's possible it predates the Neolithic age, where he eventually, in some of these tales, nails him to stone. In the modern day, they nail his tail to this or do this, that, and the other. Here he is showing where he's putting on horseshoes on that, and then this is domesticating this jinn creature to end up working for man as opposed to teasing him along. And I finally got something here that's special enough to where I can turn around and get the power of the gods. Here we go with Prometheus tales and all kinds of things like that. Strange thing about this is the one they seem to date back so far. It actually dates well before the Chalcolithic age. So it might even, in a way, predate this. But these tales are woven into Satan's tales and how somebody got control of him and stuff that is in the medieval ages. But it doesn't come from that, because that same trope goes all the way back as far as recorded history and past. Because some people here had linguistics that they know are derived from each other, and they all had the tale, and then looking at the root of it, they must have at least had it here. Again, they always stop everything right there, and they never say, well, and it could have been going on for thousands of years before. Would make sense, rather than all of a sudden it happened right when everything went pow, just like whenever they tell you this was the first so-and-so, that's the earliest known so-and-so. Again, we have to learn our lesson like Aesop's fable, and these things that happened, which we see as the oldest known, and we call them the first, whenever it's not necessarily so. So these tales go back well into antiquity. And the reason they're called fairy tales is because these very fair people had something to do with it. In fact, the root of the fairies that we talk about is the Tuatha De Danann, and how they came across and re-inhabited the western part of Europe. Before that point, no one was living there. Before that point, all of these trees weren't here. They were under 2 kilometers of ice right here. There was nobody living here. Where did they live before then? Just 8,000 years ago or so. They were living down south more. A lot of them around the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, places like that. In fact, the Black Sea deluge may have helped spread farming around, they say here. It's just a hint towards what's going on, because these were the first farmers. And again, they're those Proto-Indo-Europeans. Strangely, we have a connection here, because there's these people with these fairy tales too, that ended up becoming the religions that we have today. In a strange twist to the way it goes through, just look at it simply and you go, oh yeah, that's kind of how it happened. So they started this farming whenever they had this, and the Black Sea used to be a freshwater lake. The Black Sea used to be a couple of 100 foot lower than it is now, well, over 500 foot lower than it is now. Even though we figure that the ocean only raised some 420 meters or whatever, this seemed to have got inundated a little more, so the lake that was there was a little bit down and a little bit below our current sea level that we have now. But that's a raised sea level. During the last glacial maximum, the Mediterranean and it weren't connected, so there was a saltwater sea over here, but here was a freshwater sea. It's huge, and all the things that feed off of that is like a river valley, like a Nile, but there's like 30 of them attached into it here. And they're not on the surface for you to see today. They're in the Black Sea, because it's raised up now so many feet that they are finding this 500 foot below the surface. I taught before how, if a god ever died or lied or did these things to them, they would lose faith in it, of course. If somebody had a prophecy and it didn't work out, you lose faith in that prophet and all the people attached to that guy and so on. And there was a great flood that happened before, and it dispersed all of these people out, some of which went down the Tigris and Euphrates and became these people, like the Sumerians, where we get the tale from. So we key it off on this certain time these things happen, and this is what led to that, if you're following me. But it went from a freshwater lake to a saltwater lake, and now it can't be used anymore, and all the water off of it and everything is really unusable. Becomes poisoned, becomes sour water, like the Sumerians call it and stuff. It's not really good water, it's not fresh water, it's salt water. So again, it looks like agriculture had been going on here in the Black Sea and Caucasus Mountain area, and in between that area and Anatolia, and where we were talking about near Göbekli Tepe, which has many satellites that they found now, other cities that have things, and showing concrete work and things like that. Yeah, actual concrete work. But where do these people come from? Well, a Holocene diffusion of agricultural civilization here comes out of this area that's around the Black Sea. Now, it has to do with Aryans, and they have this symbol of a swastika that's down here below you. And I don't want to hear any crap about World War II. That's something real modern. We're talking about folklore and ancient stuff, and this symbol dates back before what we're talking about now, this symbol, along with symbols like sun symbols and so on, and worship. But these linguistics from these people all come from this common part. Whether it's the Sumerians down there, whether it's the ancient Tocharians up there in China, where it's the people that went to India, the Slavs, the Celts themselves, and so on, all these linguistics hook up together. In fact, the pre-dynastic Egyptians. Oh, well, this language is different than that one. Yeah, they're just talked about. There's a dispersal of languages where it became like real closely related to each other in all these places, and over time it divulged. And just like up north, it doesn't really happen so much anymore. Whenever I was a kid, there was TV and stuff, but you can imagine just before that there are slangs that are used in New York that people out in LA are not using. When I was a kid, trends started coming on, and people would have it somewhere like a month before or so, and then everybody would start getting it. It all become a trend, like disco and things like that. It went across, that ability to go real far, real far, real fast. That's brought about by these same people over time in a modern day. But looking back here, they used to be called Aryans. Now you can easily say Proto-Indo-Europeans, and they're not too bad about it, not too mad about it, and so on. Same situation, same exact thing, but it can't use this word because somebody else used that word one time in a wrong way. You see where it's placed, and it's really right there at the cusp of everything, and where these land masses all come together. And who was it that was there? Yeah, it's those people. Also, we can make the connection where they tell you everybody that has blue eyes is connected to somebody from about 10,000 years ago that lived in this same area. And then it comes down into Egypt. And I've shown you so many times blue-eyed Egyptians from the pre-dynastic and earliest dynasties, and in the pyramid building ages. And it's not like it went away. It kept going all the way through. King Tut's shown as R1D. That's people that are way up over here in that Germany type area and up in the UK and all that. You can follow certain traits like that. It's something that can't be denied, and it's not folklore. And the supposed story of how things happen is not folklore. In fact, if you look how meek that these people are, that they brought civilization everywhere, and they turn around, and whenever they do so, they just go arm in arm with them, go, yeah, we defeated those bad guys. Who? Whoever it was, because we did that. Whenever that's not the way it really went down, but lo and behold, now they have civilization. They get folklore out of it. Things change over time. Some people got adamant about it. Great walls were built. Some of that's facing the wrong way. Pretty amazing when you get into folklore here. I've always loved folklore. It gives me ideas of things, but you can read through it, and of course, like a kid in a cartoon, you get that idea. In a modern day, we've taken and exploded this concept to the point where we have it all in comic book characters and everything else, and so it's really torn wide open. and can be used in anything in these tropes that keep going on. In fact, that's why movies are somewhat predictable, because these tropes are getting used up. People talk, well, they can't even invent anything anymore. All Disney stuff is their same old movie from 30 years ago. They're just doing it again. Oh, we're doing it live action now because we've got CGI. But we are inserting a black lesbian as the male lead. It's pretty disgusting. They think, oh, well, that makes it different, and then that's virtue signaling, but we don't want to get into that here. These people, this area, so on. Artifacts found in the Black Sea may be evidence of biblical flood. Going back to where I deviated when I was talking about that before, you see, whenever a god lies, you can't believe him anymore, or what they thought of him was wrong, all those things. You can see how that works out. Well, they had already experienced this great flood before. In fact, the story of the outcome, like the concept in the Bible that you get of what happens at the end of the great flood, even using the dove and the raven and everything else, comes from the Sumerians, and it's written in the stars. But that's not the first flood. See, that was the second, and it was never supposed to happen again. Earth was going to die by fire, and this was going to happen on anything, and that didn't happen. You meant to believe that that's what somehow drove Abraham to leave there, that he could no longer believe in those gods because of what went on. You look at it, and Abraham really left Ur 8 years after Noah died. So it's not like they weren't familiar with what happened. That's in the biblical fairy tale. But then it says clearly right there, whenever he goes there, he goes to worship other gods. This also indicates that the gods of creation that they're talking about in the Bible are the Sumerian gods of creation. It's not like Yahweh's sitting around in the middle of them going, hey guys, what's going on? Well, it is if it's really Marduk, isn't it? Because he had a takeover situation like that. And in captivity, they'd have been well aware of it, really, let's just say. Let's see if I can do this. So these archaeologists said yesterday, which this is back in year 2000, they discovered the remains of a man-made structure more than 300 feet below the surface of the Black Sea, providing dramatic new evidence of an apocalyptic flood for those people found 7,500 years ago that may have inspired the biblical story of Noah. The expedition also spotted planks, cut beams, tree branches, and chunks of wood untouched by worms or mollusks. You see, because it trapped it in an anoxic level there. So Ballard was supposed to be checking that out. I did a video here 3 or 4 years ago now about Bob Ballard. You can look it up. Probably just look up Bob Ballard on my site and you'll see it, where he went and he was supposed to be finding a ship in the Aegean Sea. And in doing so, he ended up taking a side trek over here and testing their equipment out, and found a stone circle that's below the surface enough to where it wasn't exposed any time in the last 8,000 years. It had to have been before then, overlooking the Mediterranean at a much more lower level at that point. It's a Stonehenge type circle. It's a Göbekli Tepe like circle, and it's dating towards that same time that's right there. But then he went over and did some Titanic like looking around in the Black Sea here, and he found a bunch of ships and things, and one of them I did a video on, shows that it looks almost like it fell just 5-10 years ago maybe. It really doesn't look like it's totally gone. Some of its sail matter still lists and everything else too. It's like those bog bodies and mummies, how they get kept there. It's a little different though. It's a low oxygen level. They can't rot. So it's beyond our wildest imagination. Explorer Bob Ballard, leader of the expedition, said yesterday, wood is existing much shallower than we thought. When we go deep, it can only get better. So last year, the team discovered outlines of an ancient coast 550 foot below the current water line. That's what I was telling you, where it was kind of below sea level at one point there. When it came over, it started rushing through. First visual evidence of a flood that had occurred in the region aeons ago. So it's where the idea we get a flood from, in this idea of those people having it at one time, and it wasn't supposed to happen again, and it happened again. And then Abraham left. I strongly believe this is a remnant kept of that idea where they already knew it and figured it all out. Lords of Arata and everything else. It all came from down that run right there. All you have to do is go back upriver and the stories get younger and younger, and here we go. But there is a lot of connections between everyone across the known world at that time and after, from English, German, Spanish, Greek, and Latin, and even Sanskrit, as we said here before, with symbols, with their language itself. It's undeniable. DNA stepped up to the plate and it said, yo, yeah, there's a lot of R and M and K over here, and that this once happened, and it was part of the caste system that they had up until a real recent time, and it can still be exhibited easily by looking at the people and the variety that they have of them. So tales can be shown from that too about Nala and making of a bridge that was supposed to have been what we call Adam's Bridge now, but then it was Ramasitu. And there was a monkey type people that he gave a special hug to. And when he gave a special hug to them, then all of a sudden, whenever he needed them, they were smart enough to understand and talk to him. In fact, Nala is credited with the idea of making the bridge across. You can see this and with the monkey gods and situations like that, but let's not go into that too deep. But so these remains have been found here, and they date up to about 7,500 years ago. All of this that they had going on, which is totally submerged now, these people experienced a great flood. Here they talk about, historians have noticed similarities between the biblical account of Noah's flood and the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Babylonian poem written in the 3rd millennium BC, suggesting both may be based on the same historical event. I'm telling you that the Sumerian flood was the second one. Whenever it happened to there, it's in the Lament of Inanna. They even found it. Woolley and other people found the actual flood. The only thing is it didn't go up over the mountains or do anything that you're led to believe in the Bible. It did it locally. And locally it would have looked the same way. Have a tsunami in Japan come happening and stuff, and the boats are going inland and everything, miles, and all this happened. That's what they said. These people couldn't swim. It was 18 cubits deep. It's what it says in the Bible too. Then it says over the hills and far away, but no, it didn't happen that way. That story's also written in the stars. See, that's why we know it happened. Well, these people that wrote up Folklore ended up figuring out this story was right there in the stars. We already had a thing of the river. Don't tell me they never experienced a flood on any river or anything, or a bad winter followed by an early summer which melted everything away, and they got a worse flood than normal. They're